Welcome to the Work Inspired Podcast. I'm your host, George Lucas Pfeiffer, and on today's show, we have a very special guest. J Kuper is one of the country's top residential brokers. He's a principal broker at Kuper Sotherby's International Realty, and he's the co-founder of Brokerage Engine. Today's residential market is red hot. Believe me, I know I'm going through the process of buying a house. So I'm so excited that Jay's on the show to talk about market trends, his vision for the year ahead, and how the future of work will continue to impact our home and personal lives. You're going to love this conversation, so let's not waste another minute. Let's get it started. Work Inspired starts right now. Jay, thanks so much for being on the show here today. So excited to speak with you. Really interested to hear your perspective. I was hoping, though, that you could give us a little bit of a background before we get started on your professional experience, what you currently do, and how you got to where you're at today.
You bet. And thanks a ton for having me. My quick background is I'm a multi-generational real estate guy. My parents, grandparents, and past or beyond that have been in the real estate business for just about forever. And growing up, it was the one thing I said I would never do because everybody did it. And now I find myself after being 12 years in the business saying that you should never say never. I love real estate and just about all capacities. And I find myself today running a real estate brokerage in Texas. And I love doing that. And I spent some time with real estate software and love the technology angle on that. Day in and day out, through and through, it's real estate all the time.
Now, I know a little something about growing up in an industry and saying you're not going to be a part of it. And then here I sit as well, being part of the business I grew up in. Tell me a little bit about the type of real estate. Are you residential, commercial, a mix of both?
Yeah, a mix of both. We really focus on residential properties primarily. We've been part of the Sotheby's International Realty world for quite some time, really since the 70s. It's a 50-year-old brokerage. And we do a lot of residential sales. We're fortunate to work in Austin, San Antonio, some really hot markets as far as the country's concerned. And they've been growing steadily for quite some time. So we consider ourselves really fortunate to get to spend time doing it.
Definitely. Yeah. Residential real estate, especially in Texas, is where you want to be right now. I am on the buying side of a transaction. We're under contract to close in June. And I can tell you that it is definitely a seller's market, and it's a red hot market and has been for the last couple months while I've been looking. So tell me a little bit about the market right now. We're coming out of the pandemic. We're in the spring. The vaccines have been rolling out. What does the residential market look like, and how long do you think this hot market's going to last?
Yeah, I think for most everybody in the country, I know you've got viewership all over the place. I think it's pretty congruent across the country at the moment. The market is hot just about everywhere. It certainly is for us. And the question is always why, which I'll do my best at answering, but there's lots of good theories on why. Things like interest rates are still all-time low, inventory is still all-time low. As material costs rise, less homes conceivably are built, so that keeps inventory low. It's always a function of supply and demand for every business there is, and so real estate's no different. But also, I think this goes without saying on some level, but just the fact that people were forced to be in their homes longer than they've ever been and spend more time. Odd thing to say that you're spending more time in your house than you normally do, but it's true. We're normally all out and about working somewhere outside the house. So since we've all had to spend more time there, it really has forced people into saying, I want to buy what I've always wanted to buy, or my house isn't working for me as much as I wanted to. I could leave it every morning at 8 a.m. and go to work. And now I'm here all day. So I think that trend is going to continue. I think we're really kind of at just the beginnings, really, of people's desire to sort of move where they've dreamed about moving and being where they want to be, as opposed to just kind of being stuck in one place. Routine can be good. We're all predisposed to not change and be in a routine. Most people are creatures of habit, but since we've been forced out of our habits, I think it's just opened people's eyes to what they really want to do. And most every day I'm working with a client or working with our agents who are working with clients who that's what they want. They're like, look, I'm going to live my dream now. Life's too short, and I'm going to buy what I want to buy and be where I want to be. And so I think, again, we're sort of like at the beginnings of that. Even though the market's been crazy, people are just starting this sort of migration to where they want to be. And so it's exciting to see. I'm interested to see how really long it lasts. And my prediction at a minimum is we'll have a very heavy remainder of this year. I've learned not to try to project more than 12 months out because it gets to be a little ridiculous. But it is hard for me in almost any part of the country to project that we wouldn't have anything but positive growth in the real estate market for the next 12 months. Past that, it's always hard to say, and big economic factors can change that. But still hard to get lumber to build a house. Still hard to find any place that has inventory. My statistic for being in this business, I think people would appreciate, and actually this is in the Wall Street Journal, is that there's more real estate agents in the United States of America today than there are active listings or homes for sale in the United States by a pretty fair margin. So that means a lot of people want to help you sell them, but there's not a lot of things to buy. So as long as that stays the case, I think we're going to see a very active market with prices being a little bit more higher than most people want, or more competition than most people are used to when they're trying to buy a house.
Sure. And, when we thought about and talked about having you on the show, obviously our business is commercial interiors, but this pandemic, like you just described, has merged the work and the home like never before. And so clearly there's been an impact of quarantine and the COVID-19, pandemic on the housing market. And I think, like you said, there's many factors that are driving the prices up, and having people think more about their actual home, their setup at home, the space that they need versus what they currently have. As companies now plan the return to the workplace or try to decide which level of flexibility or hybrid mix between remote and in-person they're going to have, do you see that impacting the residential market? Or is it now, like you said, people have had a taste, of being at home and they know what they want now, and they're saying, I'm not going to sacrifice anymore. I'm going to go out and get the house that I want, and then maybe I'll find the working environment or the employer that as a secondary.
Yep. So I would say a few things to that. First and foremost, in the residential business, the harbinger for growth or change is your business, actually, is commercial real estate, how active employers are at building out space and creating employment. Residential real estate is typically completely predicated on employment and employment growth. So if I want to see how well we're going to do in residential space, how many employers are putting things to work and not just rehabbing space, but taking space down and using it. So I'll start with that, and that'll be a good preface for the rest of this. What I'm seeing is, and I think this is going to be this really interesting phenomenon, is this sort of get back to work component of wanting to be in office space, but in sort of a different way than it's ever been done before. So I'm seeing smaller footprints for employers. So I work with a lot of employers. They're like, Jay, we want to move to Austin, for example, and I've got 50 employees and this is what we want to do. So they'll come to town and we'll steer them with a commercial broker, but we'll work hand in hand with that commercial broker and what these folks want to do. And what I'm seeing over and over is that they're building out spaces that are built more for the part-time office worker. So full-time employee, but part-time in office, which I'm seeing is sort of almost a new norm, and to the point where people are doing desk sharing. So one person is at a desk on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Another is at the same desk, sharing a desk Tuesday, Thursday, or they're in like landing spaces has become now very common. So the irony there for me with this office change up is that it's conceivable in a market like Austin or San Antonio that the density of people actually dramatically increases. In other words, words, you were in 20,000 feet as an employer, you're moving to 5,000 feet, and you're actually going to employ more people who are sharing the same space. And that seems actually very logical to me. I think one of the reasons employers historically haven't grown is because of the overhead of office space in general. And so they're like, well, if I hire more people, I've got to have more square footage, therefore the overhead's more. Now it's like, no, I can get the human capital I want and not take more of a footprint. It's more normal to work from home. The employee likes that. The employer likes that. So I think we're actually going to see businesses scale. So especially in popular markets like Austin, where people want to be, you can take this downtown office space that's more expensive than the average bear, build it out really well for your employee. So then when they're in the office, they're happy about it. But they can drive. Austin, surrounding Austin is a really beautiful place. For example, it's like the Texas Hill Country and people love to be there. It's conceivable that somebody might be willing to commute an hour and a half into town if they're just there for a couple of days a week. And if they've got a cool place to work in central Austin or central San Antonio or whichever, like that's what we're seeing more and more of in the employers that we work with. That's what they're laying out. Nothing I would have ever thought about, ever contemplated that could ever exist. And without sort of the chaos that we all experienced the last year, I don't think it would have ever been a thing, but it's becoming a thing. And we see happier people, like employees, at least from my perspective, because they're happy that they can buy the thing they want. They want 1 acre that's out of town, instead of in town, or like, Chicagoland or everywhere else. Like, yeah, I want to be outside or on the periphery, but enjoy all the benefits of being in a bigger metro. So we're seeing that in spades, and we're as busy as we've ever been trying to keep up with that. So it's been a shock to the system, but a welcome one.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a couple kind of things going on here. One, when you think about flexible space, what you're describing is the hybrid approach where you're in the office sometimes, you're not in the office other times. And so maybe you can move a little bit further from the office because you're not commuting every single day. So the days that you do come in, you're okay driving a little bit more. Then the other side of that is you talk about people moving to where they really want to be. And so maybe I'm in Chicago, but I really want to be in Austin. That's a substantial move. I'm out of state. I'm out of market. I'm not coming into the office. And so then I'm coming in via Zoom like we've been doing for the last 14 months. And I'm fully remote. We've been talking to a lot of our customers and prospects and influencers in our industry about the value of being in person to some extent, and that certainly it's not going to go back to exactly the way it was before. It's probably going to be an in-person and remote. But what do you say to people or clients maybe that you're working with on the residential side that are saying, hey, I work in New York. My business is in New York, but I really want to be in Texas. They're saying right now we can work anywhere, but obviously policies can change. Is that something that you recommend people take the leap and move out of state into a position where they couldn't be in the office 1 to 3 days a week, if that's what flexible means at their organization?
So this one's kind of tough for me because I have seen this. I think the dynamic has certainly shifted where employees are calling way more shots on how they're going to be employed. And so I see that a lot. We've seen that actually in our own business where people that are employed by brokerages don't want to come back in. And the software part of me, for example, this works out well because the software that we've developed makes it so you can work remote, no problem. And so we've kind of done hopefully some decent thought leadership on that. But yeah, I would struggle to tell an employee, hey, go do whatever you want, because I've seen employers want to buckle down a bit more and say, no, look, we need some face time. At the same time, what's the right way to say? The dreamer or entrepreneur in me says, yeah, you only live once. You go do what you need to do. And the benefit for most employees right now is, as much as we see everything on the news as far as the job market goes, it's a bit of a misnomer. It's hard to find great people. That truism still exists today. It's hard to find great people. People who are good at their job have no problem being employed these days. For the most part, just a sort of a blanket statement that I've seen. I know some people have had a struggle, but for the most part, the job market has been very active and people aren't struggling to find really good paying jobs is what I've seen. So for the employee, I'd say, yeah, do the thing that you love to do. But at the same time, if you've got a great employer, and I'd be careful on like taking the big leap of like, I'm going to go live in the Bahamas because we've got a work remote policy now at work. Because it does seem like the human interaction you mentioned can't go without, giving some credence to that. Like you've got to, I've seen this in my own world. I love working remote, or I've loved part of that, but so much of our business is social. So being in front of people is really important. So I just don't think we can miss that. I think if everyone, both employer, employee, companies in general, can adapt to a more hybrid model, I think that's the future. I think that will work for what most people want out of life and employment, and for employers too, for their employees.
Yeah, I agree. The other thing that you just brought to light is the nature of the work, right? I mean, your brokers will have a hard time, and maybe there's some new technologies and way to do it, but I'm thinking of the broker that I worked with, to not be there when we're seeing a space, a house, that would be problematic. We just show up and he's on a Zoom call. I'm not sure how that would look. So obviously in a high relational in-person role, there's probably more of an onus to be there and be in person than maybe the people that are developing your technology service, Brokerage Engine. Maybe they could be anywhere in the country or the world because those jobs could be done better remote. But then that brings up the question, all right, when you think about company culture and some of the benefits of being together as an entire team and having that the personal relationship, I think that's one of the big challenges a lot of companies are going to face is you've got some people that are in person and then some people that you've actually maybe even never met. They've only ever been on a computer or on a screen. Is it a different relationship or a different almost type of employee or that you've got in those fully remote people versus those that are in the office at least part of the time?
Yeah, so I've got two comments there. One, the way it actually is funny. I've never thought about this until you were describing, the agent relationship and like if they were on the car and on a Zoom. The interesting thing about my profession with real estate brokers is I think they probably were some of the original work remote employees because no real estate agent works in the office like 9 to 5 like the rest of us do, right? Like they're always remote. So their view of the world is much more like the work remote people have now. So I think that's maybe that's worth stating. But the second part actually I think is really fascinating too. Like, what about the culture? And I'm going to go out on a limb here, George Lucas. Like, I think I'm just going to throw this out, but I think I'm accurate here. And that like in this last year of being remote, our teams, for example, at our company use Slack to communicate. And what I found is that Slack is lit up all day. People are sharing like professional and personal things. And we've left Slack open in that way. Like we don't highly regulate like only work talk here. It's very much like open sharing and people kind of getting to know each other. And I'd almost liken it to, and this is a stretch for me because I was never part of this era, but like how prolific dating apps are. Right? Like you use these dating apps, you'd think that that's impersonal. No, like you get to know somebody pretty quickly. It seems I've got lots of friends that have been successfully married off a dating app. I'd like to think actually that there's an element of all this that says, hey, working remote and communicating with some of these new technology or bits of technology could actually foster a great relationship. I know for the longest time, it's been older generations have picked on younger generations for not being social. They're down at their screens, and younger generations make the argument that they're actually very social, more social even than previous generations, because they're in constant communication with each other 24 hours a day. What I found in our own companies is that people who work for them are actually communicating more. They communicate after hours. And so I think there's something to be said for that. I know everybody in the previous eras, like the company barbecues and the team building exercises that typically get a lot of cliche thrown at them. But I'd like to think that there's probably a new era of work remote that actually fosters better relationships or even more direct and meaningful relationships, even if they're not in person. So I'm a very much in-person guy. I'm an extrovert by personality trait, and I like to be around people, and that's where I get my energy. But at the same time, I do think I've gotten to know people in a different way than I ever would have if we didn't have this arrangement. So I actually have to say that I don't think it's going to destroy much. If anything, I think it could really foster how team building, company culture, that sort of thing work long term. And I'm excited to see that change. I think it could be very neat.
You have I think a pretty substantial commercial real estate portfolio yourself, 14 offices, or what was it, 12 offices you've got, or at least had? So tell me for your organization, what's the plan? Are you going to reduce your, the amount of offices you have because you're moving more to a remote nature? Are you going to keep them but reconfigure? What's the plan as you look at your own business?
Yeah, ironically, I think we will end up expanding our locations, decreasing, and that's a little bit relative, our square footage. So if I took all the square footage we have now collectively and where we're trying to be, I would reduce our square footage. We just don't need as much anymore. And we've proven that. We've actually had our offices open. We were closed completely, no staff in office until May 1st, this month. And since we've been looking and watching all of our offices with staff in them, they're not heavily populated by agents. Even back to what I mentioned before, agents have always been remote workers, right? They're always out in the field working, but there's not a whole lot of traction in the office. I think we could reduce heavily our square footage. With that being said, our market's very active and we want to be in more geographic locations. So I think we will add locations and be in more markets because our market is expanding. But fundamentally, we just don't need as much square footage in each one of them. I actually prefer a better built out small space than a really large mediocre space. And so we're excited to sort of renovate and build out and change up our square footage or our floor plan. But I don't anticipate really eliminating offices. If we're actually looking at a couple now that we are eliminating only to put them in better geographic locations, but not because we don't need them at all. But our business is very much in the community, and public facing. And so having those sorts of locations is important to us.
Sure. Will the type of work that's being done in those locations be the same as it was before the pandemic, or will that change a little bit?
I think it'll primarily be the same. Mm-hmm. We very much, our offices are built out to be administrative hubs. We process a lot of contracts and we meet with clients to work through contracts and forms and marketing and those sorts of things. So I think the work there will stay the same. Some of the things that we have shifted up, though, are things like our marketing initiatives. We've got in our company of about 400 agents, about 15 to almost 20, actually, really great marketing folks that focus on the marketing efforts of our agents and our clients. And they used to be in office all day, every day, just kind of cranking out the cool work that they do. They, to me, will now be much more work remote, so they can get done what they need to from a remote standpoint and then be on site when needed. We do a lot of direct client interaction and they can be there for that. But being in office all day, not as required. They were remarkably, our marketing team was remarkably equipped to do what they needed to do and very productive at it during this whole sort of lockdown experience. So I think that will fundamentally change for sure on how we've operated in the past.
Definitely. I want to circle back to something you said earlier about being able to live a little bit further outside of a city if you're only coming into work a couple days a week, a few days a week. One of the things that I think is really interesting to contemplate is the impact that the future of work will have on urban areas. Obviously, like you said, the correlation between commercial to residential, and that's how you traditionally looked at activity in the market. If enough organizations consider either consolidating or shedding some of their commercial real estate, what impact do you think that will have to the way that cities look or feel?
So I had opinions about this early on, and I'll tell you that they've changed pretty considerably. I thought that for sure there's been such a push towards the urban core. It's been like, I think, the popular catchphrase, the growth of the urban core. And early on, I'd say 90 days into pandemic and shutdown, I'm like, this urban core dream is toast. There's just no way. People are not going to want to do this anymore. They're not going to want to be in heavily populated places. That to me has completely changed. I think that to take, for example, condo sales in both Austin and San Antonio, we've never been more active in condo sales. People are chomping at the bit to live right on top of each other in these markets. And I think there's good reason for that. But essentially the fear of something like a pandemic isn't driving people out of being in the urban core. So for as far as employment goes, I'll go back to my previous example. I think this is where people can live in a tower downtown and go to work a couple of days a week in the corporate office that might be 5 blocks away that they can walk to. And the other 2 days a week, they're working from the condo or, from the flat or from even like some shared work concepts that I've seen where it's like, yeah, you can be in the corporate office or you can go into a landing spot, that's down the street. I just think those things will become way more popular, or they're already becoming popular. It's not even a what if, it's happening. So I don't think there's like less congestion in urban core. It's probably sort of a bigger demand to make that happen. Because again, I think that you can get more people functionally working in a corporate environment when they can rotate. And I think we're going to see a lot of that.
Very interesting. I love the perspective you're bringing to the show. You talked a little bit about some of the kind of the benefits, the positive aspects of what we've all just gone through. One of being getting to know some of our colleagues in a different way. Another, the increased use of technology, and even you yourself are creating new technology to innovate and to do things differently. Are there any other kind of silver linings or things that will be positive impacts that we'll be able to take with us out of this experience we've all just gone through?
Yeah, I do. I mean, this is maybe tying together some of the things that I probably rambled on before about, but I think functionally people doing what they like to do is good for everybody. And I hope a positive outcome of all this is that there is this sort of like employment shift or people moving, that functionally people are doing what they love to do. And that's good again for everyone. We all know the person that might be at work that's clearly unhappy with what they do, and that sort of weighs on everyone else. I think if people are functionally finding what they enjoy to do, I think that's a really good benefit. There's this element too of all this that's very much like, and I can relate to this a lot because of our industry, is like moving. I hear it all the time how stressful moving is, and it is. I've done it. It's stressful, but there's also this sense of relief. You end up shedding like half of the stuff that you don't need, and you've been forced to change. So kind of to a comment I made before, we're all creatures of habit on some level. We all hate change, whether we admit it or not, but to change is good. Like we have to change. And so I think this has been a forced change on such a massive scale that we've just had this reset across the board in lots of industry and in employment, in retail, commercial, hospitality. I mean, how much has everybody had to adapt? But there's a big win for that. I mean, there's a lot more. I'll give you a really simple example. I love touchless payment. Like I love using my phone. I'm a major nerd. I love to do touchless payment. And like we've been forced into that, right? Because people don't want to handle money that could have COVID-19 all over it. And so much more people have accepted touchless payment. That's great for me. I love doing those sorts of things. So little things like that, all the way to big career changes and life decisions that are happening, I think is a real win. I think sometimes the killer is when, and I've said this for myself, is that I haven't done enough in the retrospective that I wish I'd done. When it was like, when the restrictions are lifted, I'm like, oh, wait, why haven't I done more? Like I needed to make more decisions, but there's still time to do that. And when we focus a lot on that now is like, hey, we want to make sure as we're getting back into it, that we're doing it using and learning from ourselves, like learning from these efficiencies that we've gained and not going back to normal. Normal would be bad on a multitude of levels. I mean, we did great before, but we've done better since. So we want to just kind of keep with that theme as much as we can.
Well, I think that's a really positive and healthy attitude to have. I mean, you guys have obviously been doing very well. And the fact that you're still looking to change and innovate and saying, this is positive, we should be taking more out of it. We haven't done enough. I mean, I can tell that that's the entrepreneur in you. And I love to hear it. I like to finish each episode by asking just a couple questions to you personally about your professional success. The first is, has there been a resource that you would recommend to others that you found particularly valuable in your career?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's, There's probably one that pops in my mind, just like as you asked the question, that I love it. And it's, everybody knows Warren Buffett, he's like a household name. Not everybody is as familiar with his partner, Charlie Munger, but Charlie Munger did this great speech. I think it was at Harvard, and it's on YouTube. You can watch it. It's over an hour, but he essentially talks about like human decision making and how that can go poorly, like that essentially how we can get in our own way. And I do this to myself all the time. It's not like the competitor that gets you. Typically it's you get yourself. Like we tend to be self-saboteurs, whether we know it or not. And Charlie has this great speech on YouTube. Highly recommend looking it up. And he talks about this, and it's long. It's like an hour, and it's wordy because he's a brain. But that has been one of my favorite resources. There's a couple of books that have been super valuable to me that I tend to reread a lot, and one of them is called "Ego's the Enemy." And it is a fantastic book. Again, it's a bit introspective, or it forces you to be a bit introspective. But it's a win. So I highly recommend that of all books I've read. I tend to read that at least once or twice a year. And then I've just had great mentors. Like I try to seek out mentors, and I always try to gravitate to a mentor who's willing to tell me where they failed. I had a great call with a younger person. I hate to admit that I'm not young anymore, but I don't think I am, but a younger person kind of getting into the business, and they were asking me questions. And I told the person, I said, listen, you have to make sure that you're taking advice from people that have told you where they failed. Because if they don't tell you where they failed, they're lying to you about other things too. And it's sort of pointless to hear from somebody if you don't know that they're willing to tell you where they failed. That's typically where the best lessons are. So I don't know if any of that strung together well, but those three things alone have helped me out quite a bit.
Very much so. I think that's great advice. Speaking of great leaders, effective leaders, outside of recognizing their faults and their failures and being able to communicate and learn from them, are there other characteristics that you've seen that are consistent across some of these mentors that you've had?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I think the prototype of being like Alexander, the great sort of leader. And all I mean by that is that you sort of lead from the front, that you're going to do. You're not going to ask anybody to do what you're not willing to do. The leaders I've gravitated to and the people I ask for advice for very much lead that way. It's like, whatever you want to call it, servant leadership or even self-sacrificial. They're in it with everyone else. They're not sort of looking for position. They sort of gain their position from respect from everybody else. And I've seen that forever. That works. Typically, people don't like it when it's not that way, at least from my experience. But that's been a great leadership training for me to say, sort of observe humble leaders, great leaders. And that humility can come in lots of shapes and sizes. I've seen very powerful, heavy-handed, but also humble leaders, but they're willing to serve others first and or lead from the front. And I think the world needs as many of those types of leaders as we can get. I think that would prove itself to make for a better world if we had more and more of those.
I agree. Jay, you've given us so much already. Last question.
Sure.
If you were retiring today and you wanted to leave behind some wisdom or a last piece of advice, what would you tell your mentorees, or just those that were going to fill in for your large footsteps or your large shoes that you were leaving behind?
Yeah, you bet. Mine is, I have to admit, this bit of advice is not unique to me, but I'm going to give it anyway because I think it's super important. Is that I think there's this big tendency for younger people to not want to fail, and I've heavily benefited from trying and failing versus trying to be perfect. I've even been criticized in the past, even from my leadership position, where somebody said, "Hey, Jay, you're not prepared enough to do whatever initiative I was trying to do," and like heavily criticized actually. And I've found, in all honesty, that was the best thing that I could have done even if it wasn't perfect. And I think that there continues to sort of be an element in our society at large that's looking for perfection or lack of failure. Social media doesn't help with this, right? Everything looks perfect, but that's not how the world works. And if you can get yourself into failing and being okay with it, not that you want to fail, but that you're learning from the failure and you try to do that as early as possible, you will be infinitely powerful. And so there's elements that I wish I'd done more early because it's harder to do it later. But that would be my wisdom, if you want to call it that. And it's something that I've just learned from others, is that you've got to be willing to fail. You've got to be willing to do that multiple times and just don't get sucked into the perfection paradox, because it doesn't exist. And if you can kind of come to grips with that, again, you'll be infinitely powerful, because that's how the world works. It's failing forward or learning from a mistake. And you're not going to get very far if you're not willing to take that sort of a risk. That's entrepreneur or not. That happens is literally true for everyone. So that would be my wisdom that I'd try to impart. Fail early.
It's great. It's great wisdom. And a follow up to that is when you say, don't let perfectionism get in your way. Is it more of a people aren't acting because they're afraid it's not perfect? Or is it that people need to act sooner and not try to wait so long to make it perfect?
Yeah, I think it's probably the latter. There's a concept. When I was in my 20s, I ran for city council. This quick side story. I ran for city council in the town that I live in outside of San Antonio. I was 28. And the only reason I did it is because I saw this sort of analysis to paralysis that was happening on the city council that I lived in, where they would just analyze and want it to be perfect and just never acted. And acting on half of the good idea is better than never acting at all on the perfect idea. And there's some exceptions to every rule, but I just see when people want to do the thing that they want to do, or try the thing that they want to try, or roll out the initiative that they want to roll out, there's lots of voices that push back. And maybe this is the point worth adding. So I'm glad you added that part. Doing what I'm describing and sort of taking the risk to not be perfect means that you'll most likely get critiqued by someone. And I think people fear the critique. And if you can avoid fearing the critique or not let it get you down, surround yourself with people that'll give you critiques, but give you, credit where credit's due, you're going to do a lot better. Because in all the scenarios that I've done where I feel like I failed or I pushed out something that wasn't perfect, I got lots of critique. And at the beginning, I hated it. I mean, and I don't love it now, but I've come to grips with the idea that you're not going to do anything worthwhile without getting some critique. So it's that looking for the perfection and looking for no one giving you resistance. Maybe that's part of it, and I'm phrasing it poorly. But if you're only looking for 100% buy-in, you and your mom can't be the only ones in the room. My mom would agree to anything, right? That I said, but you've got to be vulnerable enough to know that you're pushing forward with things or making decisions that not everybody agrees with. And that's okay. I think it's one of the harder parts of the world we're living in is the idea that multiple viewpoints working in harmony is a bad thing. It's not true. Our country's been great because, and the world even has worked out great because people have different ways of thinking. And my version of perfect is not your version of perfect. So why try to match anybody else's? You got to put stuff out and put yourself out there. And again, be willing to fail and be willing to get critique and learn from that, because that's what wisdom is. I mean, that's the great part about your question. Wisdom, I'll botch a definition because I don't have Webster up, but it's just a summary. It's just having more experience. I mean, that's what wisdom is, not being smart. It's having more experience. And so make sure you gain wisdom by getting more experience. And if that can come through failure, you're all the better for it.
So well said. Jay, this has been an absolute pleasure. I so respect what you're doing. Appreciate your insight. Some of these lessons from this great residential market that we can maybe apply to other industries and other aspects of what we're doing. Really, really appreciate you being on the show. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I really appreciate you having me on.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this conversation, please take a moment to rate our show. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the Work Inspired podcast so that you don't miss any of the incredible guests we have planned for upcoming episodes. We'll continue to find the best and brightest minds in business so that you can learn, grow, and succeed, and so that we can all work inspired. Work Inspired is brought to you by BOS, a leader in commercial working environments and a Hayworth best-in-class dealership. Experience our 360 approach and discover the team, tools, and techniques required to navigate the complexity of your next workspace at BOS.com. If you have ideas, feedback, or would like to be featured on our show, please email podcast@BOS.com. Thank you for listening. This has been a Workspace digital production. If you're interested in launching a podcast at your organization, please email info@workspace.digital for a free consultation.